Take a look at this correlation matrix. Can you tell which variables are correlated with each other and group them accordingly? How many groups do you think there are? Well, at most, if they were not correlated at all, then there'd be 10 groups, right? Each variable would be a group. At the other extreme, they could all be highly correlated to each other, all of them. So they might just be one group. But very likely, the number of groups will range somewhere between 1 and 10, right? Okay, so which variables are likely in the same group if we take a look at this one? Eyeballing the table and focusing on the first column, it looks like variable 1 is correlated with variable 3, 5, and 6. So they might be in the same group. Eyeballing the second column, it looks like variable 2 is highly correlated with variable 4. Now eyeballing the third column, we already noticed that variable 3 is related with variable 1 and also variables 5 and 6, etc. Now we start doing this across all the columns, and we can see how tedious and error-prone this eyeballing exercise can be. Therefore, you might ask yourself, there might be a better way to systematically do this via some computational methods, right? And actually, there is. It's called PCA. So this is the intuition behind PCA. We are taking a look at the correlation matrix and trying to see which variables are moving together. Then, we try to group them by their correlations. So for a 10 by 10 matrix, there might be 10 groups if there are no correlations across them, or just one group if they are all highly correlated with each other, or somewhere in between like 1 and 10 for all other cases. However, there might be variables that correlate highly with some groups but still correlate somewhat with other groups across the other axes. We saw this in a previous video regarding the video walkthrough. Now this introduces some difficulty as to where to actually pigeonhole these variables if they correlate highly across different groups. With principal components, the axes are perpendicular to each other, so any data that plot perfectly within an axis will have zero correlations with the other axis, meaning there's no spillover to other axes. Now in this case, instead of plotting raw data, what we do is we project the correlation matrix onto this axis via the eigenvalues. That's how we can distribute the explained variation across the components. So for a 10 by 10 matrix, there will be 10 eigenvectors. Therefore, there will be 10 principal components. There will be 10 eigenvalues, and they'll come from transforming the correlation matrix A into scalars called lambda, the eigenvalues, that explains how much a principal component V carries or explains the correlation matrix when you do that across the 10 axis. And again, this is a review of a previous video. However, the variables themselves, not the correlation matrix A, do not plot purely along the eigenvectors like A gets projected via the lambdas. More likely, the data will plot along one or more axes or principal components. So there'll likely be groupings of variables by correlations, since the variables won't plot purely across principal components. Remember, for a 10 variable set, if there are no correlations, then there will be 10 groups. But if there are correlations across the variables, then necessarily variables will group across some axes and the groups will be less than 10, as we've been trying to do a while ago. So if there are 10 variables, there will be 10 axes. If some variables correlate, there will be less than 10 groups, meaning there will be groupings of variables across some axes. And you have this diagram to show that idea. Since they group across some axes, we can try to look for factors that explain the variables. For this end, we will call such axes as factors, where these variables group together. Looking back at the previous exercise as a review, the factors were arrived at after analyzing the groupings of variables. In the end, the factors are actually just principal components, but were given a name since variables loaded very heavily along them. And we refer you to the previous video regarding the PCA and regression walkthrough videos where we see this example. Do kindly take a look at that video. So going back to the starting exercise, again we have this. Now using QuantProf Lite, we can get the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of the correlations as shown below. Now, Doing a running total of the eigenvalues, we see that three principal components already explain 6.22 over 10 or 62.2% of the total variance. Alternatively, we can also use the eigenvalue greater than 1 as a rule of thumb. So we can select three eigenvalues here and say that there are three principal components that are significant enough and that using these three explains 62.2% of the total variance, like so. Now, having decided to use three principal components, we can drop everything else. Now, we try to group these variables across these axes or principal components. Now, to do that, we shall use the rotated loadings instead, because the rotations allow reworking the numbers to make it easier to group the variables. Now, here's the rotated loadings using the Varimax method. Next is we sort the variables by column using Excel sort procedure, and we'll show how we're going to do that at the end. The goal is to sort the variables so that they load highly in one principal component but low on the other principal components. So here's the original table and the results after sorting things out column by column. As we see, these variables load very highly on one particular principal component, and they are encircled to show the groupings. And we've color-coded the variables to easily define them, as they load highly on one principal component but lowly in the others. Now, consistent with what we did before, we'll now write factor 1, factor 2, and factor 3 instead of axis, principal component axis 1, 2, or 3. And then we grouped the variables that load high on factor 1 but low in everything else. So we have this group 1, group 2, and group 3 that load highly on factors 1, 2, or 3 respectively. Then from here on, we will try to do the meta-analysis of what these variables stand for and try to guess what the factors could be based on what those variables actually say. However, that kind of meta-analysis cannot be done here because these are all hypothetical data. However, you can take a look at the previous video walkthrough, which shows an example of how the factors can be defined based on the variable names that come out as they load on particular factors and load low on the others. Now, this is the idea behind unsupervised machine learning via principal components. With this kind of analysis, an underlying structure could be unearthed wherein it's the procedure itself that determines the structure rather than the analyst. Here we have the three groups of variables and they load very highly on each factor and low on the others. What are the uses of factor analysis? As discussed in the video walkthrough, it improves the regression modeling via dimension reduction. Now, if regression were not the intention, this is still another way to group variables using their correlation behavior. And that's one use of factor analysis, just to group the variables via their correlations. Just for comparison, cluster analysis uses the data centers and how far points are from their center to determine which group they belong to given the raw data. That's why under unsupervised machine learning, you'll have principal components analysis and factor analysis, and also cluster analysis. Well, that's all we have for today. Please like and subscribe to support the channel and see you in the next video.